My name is Micah Corser. I'm a senior at New College, Franklin. Welcome. We're glad you joined us tonight for our Collegium lecture, hosted by New College, Franklin, where we have an opportunity to hear from Dr. Brad Littlejohn. New College, Franklin is a four-year classical liberal arts college that trains its students in wisdom, virtue, and service by studying the 7 liberal arts: the trivium, composition, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium, arithmetic, geometry, harmonia, and cosmology. These arts train us to view the world as the ordered whole that God has created it, and they prepare us to worship Him and to serve Him. Tonight, Dr. Littlejohn will speak to us about technology and freedom to give us a taste of his forthcoming book titled Called to Freedom. After his lecture, Dr. Littlejohn will be joined by our own Mr. Johnson and Mr. Spun for a Q&A panel. After the Q&A panel, we will have refreshments upstairs and a time to fellowship and converse about the lecture. Again, we're glad that you've joined us, and we look forward to hearing from Dr. Littlejohn. Without further ado, please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you so much. Is this working all right? Sounds like it. Good. It's a real pleasure to be here. Really grateful to Nathan and to the entire New College community for this invitation. I really had a wonderful time visiting New College for the first time this spring, and excited to have the opportunity to come back so soon. As Micah said, this lecture tonight is taken mostly from chapter 5 of my forthcoming book, which shameless self-promotion, put flyers on all of your seats. So if you enjoy this lecture, then go ahead and, if you enjoy this lecture, you might throw away your smartphone at the end of it, and then you won't be able, but before you do that, scan the QR code on the flyer to order the book. All things in moderation. So, without further ado, my lecture tonight is entitled Freedom and Technology, the Faustian Bargain of Modern Life. Steve Jobs named his company Apple after a pleasant trip to an apple orchard. The bite mark in the logo was added to give the silhouette a sense of scale, lest someone think it a cherry. Yet that name and that symbol, evoking consumption of the forbidden fruit for which man was expelled from the Garden of Eden, must be inadvertently the most perfect metaphor in corporate history. Our age-old striving to be as God has never seemed more achievable than in the age of the iPhone, which promises not only to put the world at our fingertips, promises us not the bounded freedom of image bearers, but that of Olympian gods. Remote as Eve's apple may seem from the one in many of your pockets, it is there that we must begin in seeking to understand our own technological predicament, which is itself part of our larger contemporary crisis of freedom. Adam and Eve were made for freedom. But what kind of freedom? Not a freedom to do just anything, but a freedom to rule as kings, to take dominion over creation on behalf of the great king. This was a freedom bound by the limits of creaturehood. But it was a freedom enjoyed at the very highest reaches of creaturehood, and intended for an even greater exaltation and glory, if Adam and Eve had passed the test. But they just didn't have the patience. Take and eat, and you will be like God, the serpent promised. Kingship and queenship were not enough. Adam and Eve longed for the freedom of infinitude. And strangely enough, they believed that creation itself, a fruit grown from the dust of the earth, could give them the power that belonged only to the Creator. This is the temptation that technology poses in every age, the lure of transcending our limits, becoming gods, and doing so without the trouble of waiting. Technology promises us reward without labor, or at any rate more reward with less labor. With technology, we take the stuff of creation, which we have been called to guard and keep, and use it to rival and defy our Creator. Just in case we didn't get the message from Genesis 3, God repeats it in a second fall narrative in Genesis 11. Now it is not a fruit grown from the dust of the earth that will enable man to reach the heavens, but bricks baked from the dust of the ground. With their extraordinary technological abilities, men are now able to build a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and thus to make a name for themselves, rather than waiting in patient devotion upon the name which is above every name. Recognizing the power of human ingenuity, God discerns the peril that awaits our effort to transcend the limits of our creatureliness. This is only the beginning of what they will do, and nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Sure enough, it was only the beginning of what we would do. Today we have pierced the heavens and walked on the moon. We have split the atom and called down fire from heaven upon our enemies. But of course, technology is not all bad, far from it. We were made, after all, to take dominion over the creatures, to transform the voiceless creation, that it might give voice to the glory of God through art and music and metalworking. Genesis testifies to the deep ambiguity of all of our technological making by attributing the earliest technologies, music making and metallurgy, to the descendants of Cain. But if we were tempted to view such works as evil in themselves, Scripture quickly rebukes us in Exodus, where these same Cainite technologies become the instruments of the Spirit for the glory of God. Quote, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the Spirit of God, with ability and intelligence, with knowledge and all craftsmanship, to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, to work in every craft." When David reforms the tabernacle worship and Solomon builds the temple, the technologies of music making are likewise offered in service to their Creator. And when in Revelation 21 the kings of the earth bring their glory into the New Jerusalem, we can be confident that this glory includes the astonishing fruits of human technology over the millennia. Technology is not merely a means by which we bring the original hidden glories of creation to full expression. It is also a means by which we resist and in some measure roll back the curse of Genesis 3. If we turn to technology to reduce human labor, who can blame us in a world where creation itself now fights against us and increases all sorts of labors? Cursed is the ground because of you. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. But rather less sweat, thankfully, in the age of the tractor and the combine. I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. But rather less pain, we should be grateful in the age of modern medicine. Indeed, even the most determined Luddite amongst us, I feel sure, does not want to go back to a world before antiseptics and anesthetics, a world in which a large share of pregnancies ended in agonizing deaths for both mother and child. So what is technology then? A God-given tool for mitigating the pain of the curse? A manifestation of our original calling to take dominion over the world? Or a means by which we seek to turn creation itself against the Creator, straining against the limits of our finitude so that we might be as gods? Clearly, it can be all three. It can be a means of resisting the bondage of sin and death, of expressing our original creative freedom, or of ultimately destroying our freedom in a search for a freedom that is not ours to enjoy. To use technology for true freedom requires a wisdom and discernment beyond our years, especially as new technologies emerge faster than we can wrap our heads around them. But we have no choice except to do our best to grow up into such wisdom. Although technology has always been with us, it is hard to resist the sense that something has changed profoundly in the last century or two. Once, we were the masters and technology our servant. Today, we feel increasingly at the mercy of our own creations. Once, we developed particular technologies, instruments to perform given tasks. Now we seem to simply inhabit a world of technology, an all-encompassing reality from which it seems difficult to escape, difficult to lay hold of any piece of created order that we have not already reordered in our image. even if we have the good fortune to behold an unspoiled mountain vista or a sublime waterfall. We are likely to admire it only through the lens of our smartphone, reducing the world to digital forms so that we can use it to build up our online followings. With the emergence of new digital and biotechnologies, we are at greater and greater risk of trying to make ourselves as gods, and in the process rendering ourselves slaves. What has shifted? Well, according to C.S. Lewis, diagnosing the change underway 8 decades ago in his Abolition of Man, the object of our technologies has shifted. Once, we worked primarily on the raw material of the lower creation, on rocks and dirt, plants, and occasionally animals. Now we work upon human nature itself, both our bodies in the form of biotechnology and our minds in the form of digital technology. Initially, we turned our technologies upon ourselves with an eye to healing the hurts of the curse, disease, tumors, and broken bones, thus seeking to restore our nature to its proper natural operation. Increasingly, though, we are now using the same technologies to try and free ourselves from the very limits of our creaturehood, to achieve an abolition of the slavery of simply being human. This, as Lewis observed, was a fool's errand, for our progressive quest to free ourselves from the constraints of nature must backfire once it passes this point. It is like the famous Irishman who found that a certain kind of stove reduced his fuel bill by half, and thence concluded that 2 stoves of the same kind would enable him to warm his house with no fuel at all. Once we turn our technologies upon ourselves with the idea of remaking the human condition, we are both subject and object to this power, master and slave. Lewis again. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well. Each advance leaves him weaker as well as stronger. In every victory, besides being the general who triumphs, he is also the prisoner who follows the triumphal car. Nowhere are the godlike pretensions of modern technology more apparent than in the digital realm. Nowhere else do the warnings of Genesis 3 echo so loudly. With the digital realm, it seems we have finally found a way to escape the basic limitations of creatureliness, the constraints of time and space, the stubborn resistance of materiality. We can, like the characters in the profound technology parable Inception, make our own world, generating images and experiences that would be impossible in the real world, living out fantasy lives that provide escape from the dreariness of the ones God has called us to. We can also aspire to godlike knowledge, with nearly instantaneous access to nearly everything that has ever been known. We can do all this with the absolute minimum of effort. Eve at least had to reach up and pick a fruit to be like God. All we have to do is swipe a forefinger. And nowhere else do we see so clearly the self-defeating, self-enslaving character of the modern quest for technological liberation. In one of the most memorable of the Screwtape Letters, Lewis describes the condition of man in the grip of acedia, the world weariness that drags us away from God and into the nothing. This is the demon Screwtape speaking. You can make him waste his time not only in conversation he enjoys with people whom he likes, but in conversations with those he cares nothing about, on subjects that bore him. You can make him do nothing at all for long periods. You can keep him up late at night, not roistering, but staring at a dead fire in a cold room. All the healthy and outgoing activities which we want him to avoid can be inhibited, and nothing given in return, so that at the least he may say, as one of my own patients said on his arrival down here, I now see that I spent most of my life in doing neither what I ought nor what I liked. Nothing is very strong enough to steal away a man's best years, not in sweet sins, but in a dreary flickering of the mind over it knows not what and knows not why, in the gratification of curiosities so feeble that the man is only half aware of them, in drumming of fingers and kicking of heels, in whistling tunes that he does not like, or in the long, dim labyrinth of revelries that have not even lust or ambition to give them a relish, but which once chance association has started them, the creature is too weak and fuddled to shake off. Such a state of self-alienation is nothing new to the digital age. Lewis says that a column of advertisements in yesterday's paper will do. But it has never been easier than in the age of the smartphone, when anything or nothing is sufficient to attract our wondering attention to the glowing, vibrating screen in our pocket. A family of 5 sits silently on a train, oblivious to the breathtaking scenery outside. Not because they are absorbed in conversation with one another, but because each alone is observed in his or her phone. A teenager stays up late at night, not celebrating with friends, but staring at images on a screen in a cold, dark room. You tire momentarily of the conversation at a party, and rather than expending an ounce of effort to enliven it with a witty observation, you pull out your phone and scroll idly through the latest posts by people you care nothing about on subjects that bore you. The holidays pass, and you realize you have wasted them not in rest or recreation, but in the gratification of digital curiosities so feeble that you are only half aware of them, but which you are too weak and fuddled to shake off. The darkest, cruelest, and most enslaving form of this phenomenon is, of course, pornography, which sucks its users into dim labyrinths that have not even lust to give them a relish, only the lure of novelty, the promise of escape. But the soul-destroying power of internet pornography is really just a particularly vicious form of the power of the internet generally, with its endless parade of images and information stoking an unquenchable thirst for novelty, a restless, aimless foraging that seems to leave us hungrier and emptier the more media we consume. Just as pornography renders its users less able to experience or enjoy real sexual partnership, so do all our bad habits of digital addiction distract us from all healthy and outgoing activities and give nothing in return. The more time we spend looking at perfect sunsets on Instagram and trying to capture our own, the less we are able to appreciate a sunset. The more effort we expend trying to curate the perfect image of our family life on social media, the less we will be able to enjoy our children, messiness and all. The more we engage in 280-character shouting matches, the less we will be able to carry on and profit from an actual debate of perspectives. And the more we resort to the GIF and emoji-laden snippets of chat threads, the less likely we will ever be to know the surpassing joys and uproarious laughter of a real conversation. In each case, digital technology promises us the freedom of boundlessness, liberated from the constraints of time and space that govern everyday life, freed from the friction that comes from physical interaction. And in each case, we find that we have simply forged new chains for ourselves, unable to discipline our own impulses to swipe and click, unable to maintain boundaries around our own time and sanity, unable to remember 30 minutes of web browsing later what we were even looking for and why. We learn again the hard way that freedom is actually constituted by limits, limits that technology relentlessly devours. So who is to blame for this? In The Abolition of Man, Lewis also warns us not to delude ourselves with the popular idea that technology is wielded equally by all. The socialist utopia of equally shared ownership of the means of production is a pipe dream. Quote, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument, Lewis warns. He immediately stresses that this does not mean that men will necessarily abuse such power. They may use it with the most benevolent of intentions. But the fact remains that this is simply what technology means in a world of unequal distribution of resources. The acquisition of new tools by certain men, corporations, or nations that will confer power over other men or nations. Nowhere perhaps is this more true than in the realm of digital technology. Although the internet emerged 3 decades ago with the promise of liberation and democratization, giving every human being equal access to the world of information and creative potential, today it is dominated by a handful of gigantic firms with greater global market power than any in history. Faced with this power imbalance and our deepening dissatisfaction over our digital predicament, it is tempting to turn and bite the hand that has fed us for the past couple of decades. Acclaimed books like Shoshana Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism have exposed the perverse incentives at the heart of much of the big tech business model, creating ever more addictive products to ensure ever more engaged users, so as to extract more and more behavioral data to sell to advertisers. And while subsequent legislative reforms and user revolts have modified the picture somewhat, there is no sense pretending that most digital technology represents a happy, healthy, free market in which firms are simply supplying customers with the products and services that will improve their quality of life. Still, we should not pretend either that all of us are simply passive victims of tyrannical big tech titans. Many of us have been willing accomplices of our own enslavement. Consider the frequent bursts of outrage about consumer privacy in the face of all-pervasive digital surveillance. There are good reasons to seek privacy, of course, but often our search for privacy is motivated by shame. No sooner did Adam and Eve commit the first sin than they tried to enter incognito mode, hiding their nakedness with fig leaves and cowering in the bushes to avoid divine accountability. From that day to this, human beings have longed for a way to keep their sins to themselves. But this is rendered difficult by our need for community. Given the weakness and fragility of our natures, we, unlike many animals, have to live in close contact with others of our kind. And these human communities tend to keep an eye on the behavior of their members. With the rise of the internet, it became conceivable for the first time in history to enjoy many of the benefits of life and society without the burden of such accountability. Far more than any previous generation, we have found a way to escape from the prying eyes of neighbors and authorities and pursue our private pastimes or vices without leaving any trace on the social world around us. Indeed, if we ever forget to enter incognito mode, we can, with a single click of a button, do what every sinner has longed to do since Eden: delete history. The reality is that most of us are quite happy to accept the ubiquitous surveillance of big data as a substitute for the intrusive personal accountability of yesteryear. We no longer watch over one another, those closest to us. And grateful for this liberation, we are happy to let Meta and Google watch over us instead. If we can escape being manipulated by our parents, pastors, and spouses, we reason, we are more than willing to let ourselves be manipulated by targeted advertisers and feed aggregators. Lewis wrote The Abolition of Man at the high watermark of rational scientific planning, in the midst of a world war in which two great powers, Germany and Russia, represented different forms of the cult of scientific management applied on a national scale, and in which even the free nations were forced to resort to massive central planning to meet the demands of a total war. Many in the West hoped that out of the war would emerge a utopian era of a peaceful and orderly society ensured by rational scientists conditioning human nature and guiding it towards some higher stage of evolution. But Lewis knew too much about human psychology to believe in such dreams. The reality he discerned was that most of these post-human schemers would be animated chiefly by the same animal desires for money, sex, and power that most powerful men have been animated by throughout the ages. And all the more so now that they rejected traditional conceptions of human nature and morality. However, perhaps Lewis still gave too much credence to the myth of scientific management, the idea that the future direction of society would be determined by a handful of men in lab coats and their political enablers lurking underneath. The reality is that by and large, our technocratic elites, whether in Silicon Valley or in Washington, D.C., are simply giving us what we demand, feeding the ravenous appetites of a humanity whose God is its belly. Having promised ourselves a brave new world in which humankind could be freed from natural limitations to pursue some higher purpose, a new order of the ages in which justice and equality at last would reign, we find ourselves staggering drunkenly after each fresh technological innovation for nothing more than the mere pleasure it promises. Or to come nearer to the depressing truth, we grasp frantically after each new technology as a drug to dull the pain of a world from which every real pleasure has been banished, as a distraction to keep at bay the nothingness into which we feel ourselves spiraling after we have traded away our very humanity in pursuit of cheap thrills. If this is true of the digital revolution, it is perhaps even more true of the revolution in biotechnology that has equally conspired to change our conception of what it means to be human over the last half-century. For all the great life-saving developments in medical technology of the past half-century, our era will no doubt be remembered by history for a string of new medical techniques and social practices all centered around that strongest of all animal desires, sex. If man chooses to treat himself as raw material, writes Lewis, raw material he will be, not raw material to be manipulated as he fondly imagined by himself, but by mere appetite, mere nature. Although we may increasingly live our lives and pursue our pleasures in the digital realm, we still find ourselves stubbornly inhabiting physical bodies. And it is over these physical bodies that the greatest cultural and theological battles of our time are still fought. When Lewis penned his prescient warnings of the technological perils before us in The Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, he had in mind chiefly the advances of medical and genetic techniques that threatened to conquer human nature itself. 8 decades on, those prophecies have largely come true through the practices of abortion on demand, artificial insemination and in vitro fertilization, genetic manipulation of embryos, and most visibly and jarringly, the transgender revolution. Through all these practices and more, Western man has manifested our grotesquely misguided idea of freedom as the transcendence of all limits, up to and including the limits of our bodily nature itself. The result has been a fundamental transformation in the concept and practice of medicine, which was once committed to the maxim, do no harm. By this principle, physicians demonstrated their recognition that the capabilities of medical technique were bound to the norms of bodily health, a good that the tools of the physician could as readily imperil as enhance. Our word health comes from the same root as our word whole. To restore something to health, it used to be understood, meant to bring it back to its fullness. The art of healthcare, then, was quite simply aimed at the good of the body, conceived in terms of its proper functioning. Disease or injury impeded the body from attaining its natural goodness, and it was the task of medicine to restore it. There were, of course, any number of things that medicine could do as a matter of pure technique. Could lop off a limb at random or cause a patient's lungs to fill with fluid, but to do these would no longer be medicine, whose first rule was do no harm. The current craze for transgender health care, then, is a contradiction in terms, at least as usually practiced. According to the policies of an increasing number of developed countries, the use of a mastectomy to treat breast cancer is to be deemed medically indistinguishable from a mastectomy to turn a 13-year-old girl into a boy. Any procedure formerly devised to treat some particular physical disease or condition now needs to be on the table to treat a wholly different and purely psychological condition. This then represents the complete divorce of medicine from health care, understood as the restoration of a body to its proper good. Instead, we have the new idea of medicine as pure technological power to achieve whatever results the patient or his manipulative clinicians desire. This transformation is the fruit of the substitution of freedom for health as the ultimate end of healthcare. On the new conception, palsy is not bad because it impairs the natural functioning of a patient's nervous system and muscles, but because it limits her freedom. By the same token, then, an unwanted pregnancy or even an unwanted set of sexual organs demand medical intervention just as surely and for the same reasons as a diagnosis of palsy or appendicitis. As Oliver O'Donovan wrote in his 1984 Begotten or Made, technology derives its social significance from the fact that by it man has discovered new freedoms from necessity. The technological transformation of the modern age has gone hand in hand with the social and political quest of Western man to free himself from the necessities imposed upon him by religion, society, and nature. Medical technique, too, has been shaped and developed with the intention of fulfilling aspirations for freedom. Freedom, in this case, from the necessities imposed upon us by our bodily nature. Once human nature itself is treated as an enemy to be conquered, however, the boundary between self-transcendence and self-destruction, between freedom and slavery, becomes indistinguishable. Once our souls, that is, ourselves, have been given up, writes Lewis, the power thus conferred will not belong to us. We shall, in fact, be the slaves and puppets of that to which we have given our souls. If our quest for godlike freedom finds its terminus in such bondage, how should we as Christians respond? Is there any escape from the dystopian trajectory that I have sketched in this lecture? Well, we should begin at least by resisting such dystopian thoughts. I have deliberately emphasized the darker side of modern technologies, but there are plenty of other stories to be told as well, of organ transplants and prosthetic limbs, of the digitization of countless libraries of knowledge, of telescopes that can discern the fingerprints of God in the farthest recesses of space. The first step towards restoring a healthy posture toward our technologies is to start asking the most basic questions of them. What are they for? What are we doing with them? What are they doing to us? We must remember the cardinal truth that just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. Too often, drunk on the heady fumes of scientific progress, we have allowed ourselves to push the limits of what our ingenuity can achieve, and assume that now that we've broken through some former barrier, it's time to bring the new gadget to market and put the new algorithm to work. But why? Just because we've been clever enough to discover or produce new poisons doesn't mean we drink them. One of the greatest of all scientific breakthroughs, the atomic bomb, is an invention that humanity has wisely refrained from using ever since. We must be prepared to exercise such discernment and self-restraint, individual and collective, when it comes to many of the most fashionable technologies, from in vitro fertilization to TikTok. Now, this will mean different things for different people, depending on our vocations. For individuals, it will mean cultivating anew the virtue of patience. This might mean not just waiting a bit longer for something, but in some cases, waiting until the resurrection. Human life means accepting limits and accepting suffering. When technology offers us an apparent escape route, we should examine it closely to see if it is not, in fact, a shimmering mirage. Infertility, for instance, is a great suffering for many couples. But accustoming ourselves to the manufacture of embryos is a greater evil. Loneliness and boredom are perhaps a milder but more ubiquitous suffering. But we should resist the siren song of social media, which will not provide the true balm of our restless heart's desire. For Christians involved in designing, producing, and marketing new technologies, humility and charity are in order. Have I really come up with a brilliant new invention, or just a quick way to make more money? Will this new product or procedure actually benefit my customers or patients? If not, there's nothing wrong with sticking with the status quo at the risk of being called old-fashioned. Of course, we do not just live in a world with technologies, but in a technological world. We are not mere individual consumers deciding which phone to buy, but we find ourselves embedded in social structures that increasingly take the newest technologies for granted. In 2003, no one had heard of a smartphone. By 2013, more than half of all new phones worldwide were smartphones. Today, in 2024, it is becoming very difficult to function in modern society without a smartphone. In such a world, responsible individual choices will not be enough. Parents in particular have a critical responsibility to their children to help them grow into freedom, which means protecting them from premature exposure to the infinite spaces and godlike powers of the metaverse, until they've grown souls sturdy enough to resist its alluring promises and intense pressures. Civil authorities, whom the Christian tradition used to refer to as fathers of their people, should also step up to the plate and exercise paternal care, taking common sense steps to restrict access to pornography and to quash medical malpractices like gender reassignment surgery. However, as technology is developing at an ever greater pace, any specific prescriptions that I offer here will soon find themselves out of date. Indeed, we are only just beginning to come to grips with the vast implications of the AI revolution and the urgent moral questions it forces upon us. The rate of technological change can sometimes seem too great to admit of theological reflection. What does not change, however, is the human heart and the spiritual roots of our fascination with technology. Trapped in fear and guilt, we tend to hide our faces from God, the source of all good, and thus begin to lose our delight in all the goods he has given us. In this condition of spiritual unfreedom, we seek escape from the limits of embodiment. warring against nature or trying to distract ourselves from it among the evanescent vapors of our own creations. Or else we may travel in the other direction. Even if we are in a state of relative spiritual health to begin with, we may begin to thoughtlessly habituate ourselves to the ecosystems of distraction that surround us, until we begin to forget what it might feel like to truly attend to a poem or a person. Our capacity for deep enjoyment thus destroyed, we quickly lose the capacity to enjoy the one who demands the most sustained attention of all. A lack of spiritual freedom may lead us to seek titillations that end in moral bondage. Conversely, the careless sacrifice of our self-mastery may drive us inexorably into a state of spiritual unfreedom. Whichever way we travel along this vicious circle, technology offers itself as a superhighway to speed our journey. The way of escape, then, requires effort in both directions. We must seek to reignite our love for God by worship, prayer, reading, and meditation, to be sure. And yet we will constantly find our minds clouded in the attempt if we are living slothful lives of perpetual distraction. We must ensure that whatever technologies we may need to make use of in our daily vocations, we are regularly taking excursions back into the heart of creation, fixing our eyes on God's creatures rather than ours. It may sound naive or cliché to suggest that we can protect ourselves from the worst ravages of a technological age by taking a hike to admire a waterfall. But that's at least an important start. As we consciously cultivate a patient attention to the goods with which God has surrounded us, we will become less tempted to graze restlessly in search of the momentary diversions that technology promises. And the more capable we become of taking joy in the goods that come from God, the more we will be drawn back in gratitude to joyful fellowship with Him, equipped with the spiritual and moral freedom to again take wise dominion over the world into which He has called us. Thank you.
We're going to begin the panel.
So do I just sit here in the middle? All right. They both have copies of my paper. I should have one too. There we go.
Brad, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming. And I thought maybe you could just tell us a little bit about where this came from in terms of what got you to write about this. It probably could be a lot of different things.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what I write is a sermon to myself. So, this is in many ways the culmination of, 10, 20 years of being frustrated with how often I find myself, after 30 minutes, browsing the web and wondering, I originally opened this for, what was that? Just you follow a trail of links. Or finding myself, like I described there, momentarily bored in a social setting and pulling up my phone, imagining there must be something more interesting happening somewhere else. And just realizing how much I was losing that capacity to be present where I was. Losing that capacity to just wait for a little bit through those brief periods of boredom where nothing interesting seemed to be happening in order to learn what interesting things were actually happening that I just didn't have the eyes to see anymore. So, when I was asked to write this book on freedom, I quickly kind of thought about what is an area in which all these technologies are marketed in terms of expanding our freedom, and yet most of us don't actually feel that way. So it's a great test case for this paradox of how can the pursuit of freedom in the wrong way lead to unfreedom.
That's great. I really like what you said about waiting a second so that you can actually see what will happen, what is interesting out there. because I think one of the things that this essay does, or this chapter, it has some lovely moments at the end, but it also keeps talking about things like suffering and limits and necessity, and saying that we're making a mistake by trying to overcome all limits. And in fact, that limits and necessity are somehow important to us. I was wondering if you could maybe expand on that in terms of what are the good of limits? How are they not just ways of saying no all the time or not getting what I want? I can't have a baby. I can't have more chocolate. I can't stay up later. Just these are not the things I'm supposed to do. How do you think about limits, and how does that help humanize us?
Yeah. So, I mean, you start from the observation that a thing without limits is not a thing at all. Anything that we can think of it as a determinate thing only because it has boundaries, right? The boundaries define the essence of anything. The only being that is actually without limits is God. To be finite means, Latin finis, to have a boundary or limit, right? So if we want to be human beings, we can only be human beings within the limits of what constitutes a human being. And that's where, I keep coming back to that Genesis 3 and thinking about what does it mean to be seeking to be as gods? It means we want to be unlimited beings, and we don't want to be limited beings. We don't want to be pursuing the particular creaturely good that belongs to us as humans. So I think we first start with just any creaturely good that you can think of is what it is, precisely by existing within those boundaries that constitute what it is. And so therefore we have to rediscover how to do that as humans if we're going to experience the good that is proper to humanity. I think, going back to the point about patience, we all know that it's a tricky thing, that point about limits, because it's also true that as humans we don't just sort of passively accept limits. Like the people who just say, oh, here's the limits, all right, I guess I'm not a good chess player, I'm never going to become a good chess player, never mind, I'll move on to something else, right? That is not a picture of human virtue, right? That's a picture of a kind of sloth. And so there is an appropriate desire to overcome limits that is part of pursuing the creaturely perfection that God has called us to, right? I always think of in terms of watching the Olympics like we did this summer, and you hear all the inspirational stories, and inspirational stories always sort of take this form of, so and so told me. They always pick someone who maybe had some health issue early in their life, like they told me I could never be able to do this, but I believed that I could be whatever I wanted to be, and then I became this great athlete. And it's, on the one hand, there's something problematic in that story that we tell ourselves, because we all want to believe we can be whatever we want to be, and that's not true. And yet it is inspiring. These are people who didn't just rest content with limits, but sought to overcome them, right? And yet, I always come back to the Irishman's two stoves thing, right? That I want to write an essay on this sometimes. So like the Irishman's two stoves is like a theory of everything, because it really is. Lewis is pointing out that you can say going like step by step in this direction is better and better and better, and so then we assume the more steps you take in that direction, it keeps getting better. But there is a point where it becomes self-defeating, and so there's a desire to overcome limits that is actually a pursuit of our properly creaturely perfection as human beings, and yet there's some point at which that then becomes self-defeating. And so you can think about this with the Olympics, like it's certainly imaginable within our lifetimes to have like bionically enhanced Olympic athletes that can pole vault 50 feet instead of 20 feet or whatever, right? But we all realize, like, why would we want to watch that? Nobody would want to watch that anymore. Like at some point you're not watching the perfection of human potential, but you're watching human beings who are no longer satisfied with being human beings, right? So the way this is a long-winded answer, but I'll just bring it in for a landing, is the way that you become that great Olympic athlete isn't by just, you do seek to overcome certain limits, but not by just an impatience with limits, like, okay, I'm just going to surgically alter myself so I can be, right? It's actually by the patient suffering of, this is the limit of my potential today, and I'm going to suffer that limit so that then tomorrow I can grow into a little bit stronger, a little bit faster, right? So it's actually precisely by accepting our limits and accepting the suffering of them that we gradually expand the abilities of our body and our mind. And of course, we know that this is a college in learning, right? You don't accept the limits of your knowledge as a static thing, but you also are not going to learn if you don't learn to suffer through those limits instead of just, asking a computer to download, all of Aristotle's works into your brain.
That's great. I was hoping you would bring virtue into it, because
Yes.
you can really sense that in the paper, that you're not, struggle is the wrong word, but you're bringing together, on the one hand, pushing past limits. How do we grow? And on the other hand, how we recognize limits. That there are pleasures to be had that are rich, and there are also pleasures which delude us. There's the Olympics and the circus, and it seems like we may not really be able to tell the difference anymore. So that what I'm hearing in what you've written is not just a screed against technology. I don't think it's really that at all, but something underneath that is maybe remembering who we are and remembering what those things are that really fulfill us, but also those things that require suffering in some way. And that can be as simple as, it's the end of the week and I would rather just eat dinner around the couch versus, get up from the couch and sit around the table and meet people face to face. That itself is a challenge, but it's humanizing in that way. So I kind of am hearing in this ways in which there's a calling to remember who we are. I'm wondering if there's ways that you have practiced that, because your work takes you into technology or into having to use the phone or use the computer, etc., quite a bit. So how have you done that, or done that in your family?
Yes. So I think the biggest, it's just like with our kids right now, we've tried to be very vigilant and diligent about putting parental controls, just mindful of how easy it is to stumble upon very age inappropriate, anybody in any age inappropriate, but we euphemistically call it age inappropriate, material. And it's actually extremely frustrating to me about like the ecosystem of homeschool education curricula. It's like if you want your kids to do online classes, the presumption is, they need access to Vimeo, they need access to YouTube, they need access to these platforms where I know there's a lot of content they could easily stumble upon that I don't want them stumbling upon. So we've had to really kind of work to try to we said our system is not, we don't have filters in the sense of the default is they have access to all content except the stuff that the parental control filters out. Rather, we have a white list, which is every website that they can visit has to be explicitly, we have explicitly listed all the sites they can visit. And so initially we were kind of doing that just in terms of, keeping them away from like pornography and such, right? But what I've realized is what it's created is a discipline in our home, and I've done this on my own device, where it's basically, if you're going to something, if they're picking up an iPad, we need to enter the code. If they're getting on the website, they need to say, can I access this website? And what it does is it creates a posture of, what's the reason? Like, there has to be a purpose. It's not just like the world is your oyster. Oh, and by the way, be careful. There's some shady corners over here. It's okay. You're picking up this tool. You're using it as a tool you don't just pick up a hammer and just walk around swinging it randomly, right? If you pick up a hammer, it's presumably because there's something that needs to be hammered in, right? So we want to have that relationship to digital technology in our home. That's, if you're opening up the computer, what are you opening it up for? If you're wanting to go to a website, why are you wanting to go to that website? And so then it just changes the sort of the fundamental posture.
Andy, do you want to jump in?
So I love the talk about the physical limitations. I'm a sucker for Olympic inspirational stories. When I started watching these, NBC does these super juicy, like 1 hour synopses of the Ironman championship in Hawaii. And I started watching those, and Katie was like, oh man, he's gonna want to do an Ironman now. And sure enough. It also reminds me of the movie Gattaca. If y'all haven't seen the movie Gattaca, it's a fantastic movie. But it centers around this one character. They're in a world where everybody's genetically altered. You really can't get ahead if you're not genetically altered. There's a scene where the guy's playing the piano and he's playing this piece and somebody comments on it and the guy says, well, you can't play that piece without 6 fingers. You have to be genetically altered to play it with 6 fingers. But it centers around this one guy who is not genetically altered. His parents didn't do that, and there's this scene where he and his brother, who is genetically altered, they always would do this competition where they'd play chicken and swim out into the ocean and see who gave up and swam back first. And he would lose, but then at the end they do the competition one last time, and he's winning. And his enhanced brother is like, "How are you doing this?" And he'd done it a couple of times, and he said, "You know what? You want to know how I did it? I didn't say anything for the swim back." So anyway, I don't know why I tell that story. Other than it's a great movie, and it's a great exploration of human limitations. But the thing about those physical limitations is they are right there in your face, right? You can't conceive of an unbounded physical capacity, because as soon as you go for it, you run into the pain of muscle ache and insufficient oxygen, and you just have to stop. So I guess I'm wondering how in the digital world, how does the digital world effectively lure us into this notion that there is some way that there is an unbounded freedom that we can possess?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. So one is, just that absence of physicality, the fact that we are interacting with other people without bodily presence, and we become kind of habituated to that, and again, whenever we do anything in the body, we can't but be reminded of our limitations. And as we seek to do things out of the body, it's easy to forget that. And the devices are basically designed, I talk about the metaphor of friction, right? So in the physical world, everything involves friction. And in fact, one interesting thing is technologies in the physical world operate not by trying to abolish friction, but by making use of friction, right? The way that your car runs is actually using the friction of one physical thing on another thing in order to produce motion, right? So we have to live with friction, and we learn how to actually leverage friction to our advantage. The goal of digital device design is to abolish friction, right? To make it so that all I have to do is swipe my finger and some totally new vista comes into view, right? The minimum possible imaginable physical effort can totally change my surroundings as I experience them, right? And I was particularly thinking about this in terms of you may have heard of Neuralink, right? Which is this idea of Elon Musk is trying to invent this thing well, which they've already done, right? Which is still kind of prototypical, but the idea is implant a chip in your brain so that you just have, and then it's connected to a digital device, and so you just have to think about something you want to see, and then it pops up on the screen. Or you don't even, like, swiping a finger, that's too much work. Just gonna think, right? And I was reading this story, I was like, how could anyone think, and they were talking like how you could compose a tweet just in your head, right? And then just, think send, and you send the tweet. As if our problem with Twitter is people not being able to get their thoughts out fast enough, right? So the thing is, friction has a refining influence. The fact that you have to push through friction to accomplish something means that if it's not worth accomplishing, you kind of realize that before you get there. If you remove friction, then you just think, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea if I did this? And then you do it before you have time to realize that it's a terrible idea, right? And so we do that in our communications. And so, like, the idea that it would be a good thing for people just to be able to think up a nasty insult, boom, and then immediately tweet it, But the idea there is to moving beyond the constraints of bodily friction, and thus being able to abolish kind of the limitations of time. It's not just the limitations of space, right? But that the space also imposes limitations of time, because it takes time to get somewhere in space. And if you can abolish the limitations of space, then the idea is you can also abolish the limitations of time. And as soon as you want something, as soon as you think it, you can be there. But again, the more you do that, like, you get more, but everything you get is much lower quality, because good quality experiences, good quality thoughts, all that takes time to marinate. All that has to push through friction in order to develop to maturity.
I just have one more, and then I think we should take some audience questions. What time do we go to?
8.
Okay. Okay, so my last question is, towards the end, you talked about, taking steps to make good decisions and asking basic questions of these technologies, like, what are they for? What are we doing with them? What are they doing to us? So can you recommend or just talk about how do we begin to think about, well, like, let's say we ask those questions, how are we evaluating the answers? How are we evaluating if what they're doing is good, and if what we're doing with them is good? Yeah.
Well, this is partly why I brought together the biotechnology thing with the digital technology, because the two are in this kind of feedback loop with each other. But when we lose the concept of that there is such an idea as a healthy human nature, right? So this is, as I said, in medicine, has to proceed from the idea that there is a healthy version of a human being, and then every form of suffering has to be evaluated in reference to, is this a deformity of a healthy human being, and therefore can medicine be used to restore this to its proper health? And so that was the task, that used to be the task of medicine, not, hey, wouldn't it be cool if I could have 3 ears, and then let's surgically attach a third ear, right? No, it wasn't just, I can think it up, it would be cool, let's use technology to do it. It was, is something missing? Is something harmed? Okay, let's restore it. And I think that that's not an easy distinction to make in many cases. I think there's some obvious cases where you can say, okay, this is obviously, someone's missing a properly functioning body part. Therefore, can we give them a transplant, give them a correctly functioning part? There's cases where we would say, like, where it's obviously augmentation, not a form of healing. But there are also border cases where it's not entirely clear whether you're talking about something that is, like, particularly with a psychological, if you have a psychological illness that can be repaired by physiological means, is that appropriate? Of course, that's what the argument for transgender surgery is. Sort of like, well, there's different arguments, but one is One would say, look, this person is having this psychological illness, so we really are responding to disease. But since we can't, I don't think this is actually the dominant way of understanding transgenderism, but one way is to say, look, they really do have a disease. This is a mental health issue, that this boy thinks he's a girl. But we can't get him to not think he's a girl. But what we can do is we can do this surgery and kind of compensate physically for that, right? Sorry, that was a long parenthetical to say. It's not always easy to say when you're on one side or the other, but it's always important to keep that in mind whenever we're looking at some new technology. And so similarly with digital technology, when are we trying to correct something that has been damaged by the fall? And when are we trying to, back to that framework I had at the beginning, right? There's correcting something that's damaged by the fall, bringing something to its originally intended created perfection, and then trying to strive for some new way of being that was never sort of proper to humanity at all, right? And so I think we need to ask of any technology, which of those three is it trying to do? And again, it's not always going to be easy to say that, since like you might say, being able to Zoom with your grandparents 3,000 miles away, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, that is a good thing, because in a sense, we might think that, well, how can we see that in response to the fall? We could say, look, if you didn't have mortality, right, if you lived forever, then that it wouldn't matter so much. That kind of you only have a precious amount of time with your grandparents, talk to grandkids, whatever. So, but since we have a very limited amount of time, it's really important to have that communication. And so therefore, we have this technology to make it possible for people even who are thousands of miles apart to communicate, right? But what that also does is it reduces the opportunity cost of moving away. It means that we disconnect from each other's lives because we say, oh, we have this technology that can always compensate for it.
Would I have moved 3,000 miles away from grandma if I knew I couldn't talk to her?
Exactly. So I think those are the sorts of things we have to ask. Very often we are using a technology to solve a problem that is itself the creation of that same technology. And we say, oh, isn't it great that I can talk to someone 3,000 miles away? And it's like, yeah, why are you 3,000 miles away? Because you have that thing, right? Which isn't to say that it's automatically wrong, but it does mean you have to be very mindful of both what is being lost and what is being gained. We always just tell ourselves the part that we're gaining and not the part that we're losing at the same time.
Yeah. Did you want to take the?
Yeah, well, just a follow-up to that. You mentioned IVF, and that's a very relevant conversation now. I think Trump said something about free IVF for all was a big thing that he promised. And a lot of pastors and churches are wrestling with that with their own parishioners. So how would you respond to kind of the line of argument, I can't have kids, that's the fall, here's a technology that enables us to restore something that we lost with the fall. Why would you mentioned it and kind of put it in that third
Yep,
category.
that's great. Yep. Yeah, so, Donovan has a great, his book Begotten or Made is kind of all on this issue. The first thing you say is IVF is not restoring anything, right? It's bypassing. So it's like a prosthetic limb or something. It's not healing the flawed reproductive capacity. It's saying, okay, well, never mind that. We're going to now technologically bypass that limitation. Which he says isn't, now that in itself doesn't make it wrong. Again, we would say anyone who uses a prosthetic limb, they're doing something unnatural, so they just need to go around with one leg the rest of their life, right? But he says we do need to actually, but it's still a morally relevant distinction, right? There are morally relevant distinctions that aren't simply between bad and good, right? Sinful and righteous. So he says that sort of compensatory medicine is always doesn't have the same moral status, doesn't have the same kind of overriding claim as actually restorative medicine. But one of the things he points out is the problem is once we have the ability to compensate, and this goes back to the point about the Zoom call. Once we have the ability to talk to grandma 3,000 miles away, we say, well, I'm not going to bother trying to live next to grandma, right? It'd be as if we don't have the technology to regrow legs, but if we did have the technology if we knew medically how to regrow legs, we were like, it's just easier and cheaper to give the person a prosthetic leg. We're just going to do that. O'Donovan says that a lot of that is what is happening with IVF. Many cases of infertility could be treated by other means in such a way as to actually overcome the impediment, but doctors just move straight to IVF because it's the quickest solution, right? The other thing to say is, of course, there are particular ethical issues with IVF in terms of that there's no way to do it without potentially destroying many embryos, right? And so if you can't, in fact, achieve the good result without doing evil in the process, then the answer is, it would be, for instance, going back to the prosthetic leg, right? If it were, you had to chop off somebody else's leg to give this guy a prosthetic leg, well, then you shouldn't do it, right? So we've lost the capacity to help teach Christian couples the importance of suffering, the importance of patience. And I think it's really worth thinking about the etymology of that word, patience, right? Patience means suffering. And indeed, having to wait for something to us is sort of the worst form of suffering as moderns. We're so used to having everything right away that having to wait at all is suffering. And sometimes that waiting is for a year, a few years, a decade. Sometimes that waiting is actually a waiting that is not fulfilled in this life. And I think probably the biggest problem with IVF is the way in which it's kind of become part of this way of it's part of this broader inability to give any kind of positive account to suffering and waiting in the Christian life. And just if we can find a technological shortcut that means you don't have to wait in faith, or perhaps even wait to the New Jerusalem for the fruition of that. If we can skip that waiting, we're going to skip it.
Other questions?
Thank you for being here. That was a wonderful talk. Along the same lines as Mr. Johnson's question, if someone then does take that sort of advice and says, yes, the Lord is calling me to suffer through this, how do we then come alongside, what would be some positive practices to come alongside those in the church who then would have those convictions and be suffering through these hard circumstances in order to follow God more faithfully or in a view that they see as more biblical? How could we come alongside them in order to support them in those times of hard suffering in order to bring about kingdom purposes?
Yeah, right. I think that's a great question, and I think it's interesting. The predicament of childlessness looms so much larger in a society of isolated, atomized families, right? People look and they say, that family over there, they have kids, and that family over there, they have kids. And they just see a bunch of happy homes around them, and then themselves alone without kids. The problem is, we're not supposed to experience life in the body of Christ that way, as a bunch of different isolated homes, some of which have kids, some have 2 kids, some have 4 kids, some have 0 kids, right? Unfortunately, the expression is forever ruined because Hillary Clinton said it, right? But it is biblically true that it takes a village to raise a child. In the body of Christ, this is one of the things I love about the Anglican tradition, is that it honors this with this insight with the practice of godparents, right? That whenever a baby is baptized, there are two or three other people from within the congregation that become parents to that child on behalf of the entire congregation. So in the sense, every time a new child is born in the body of Christ, everybody in the church has a new child, right? And obviously there's still boundaries there's still special responsibilities that the biological or the adoptive parents have, but that ability to share in the joys and trials of child raising means that families that have zillions of kids and feel overwhelmed, that burden is shared. Families that have no children and are suffering with childlessness still have the joy of participating in the shared task of raising other children in the body, right? So I think the more we actually, I think part of the reason why IVF has become such a compelling quick fix for childless Christian couples is because they don't feel like they're part of church communities in which the only way in which they can have children is through this means, right? But everybody and every adult in the body of Christ should have the experience of having children, the sort of shared children of the body. And the more that we can cultivate that kind of ethos, I think the more we can make that a cross that we bear communally rather than that we put on their shoulders alone.
Just to add to that, something that I was thinking about throughout your talk was that we don't have the strength to resist all the lures of technology by ourselves, that it's really being part of a church community, being part of a body like this, where we see people living their lives in ways that have dignity, that are for the Lord, that we actually learn it can be done, and it's beautiful to be done. And just to fill out what you've been saying, that is the way it has functioned in schools in the last few years, where students, young children, are being lured into thinking about their gender in weird ways by being invited into special classrooms and being invited into these kind of quasi-families, these pseudo-families that are not actually families, and being separated from their family. So I think your question is really apropos, but I think what Brad is saying is that it's part of the ordinary life of the body of Christ, and it's making people feel part of it, so that it's not something extraordinary to do, but if you are in that body and people know that's going on, they're going to be there for you, and your suffering is part of that body. You suffer as part of that body, and they bear it together. So I think making that part of the ordinary life of the church is really fundamental, because we've lost that in the fragmentation of society.
Yeah, I mean, Paul says when one member suffers, the whole body suffers, and it's just like, that's just not empirically true for most Christian churches in America today. Like, some families going through a struggle, health struggle, psychological struggle, whatever, they just stop coming to church. Nobody even knows that they're not there anymore, right? So we have to have the kind of churches that actually experience suffering together if we're going to ask members of the body to bear that suffering with patience.
So you mentioned kind of developing the discipline of being present in the moment. And you kind of talked about that briefly, like just going out in nature for like maybe an hour and going on a hike. Have you discovered any other methods that have helped you, or even just kind of in your journey over the years, just things that you've learned about paying attention, or disciplines that you have, or just advice in general?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know disciplines I have, disciplines that I wish that I had. Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say on that is, I talked about like when we do actually see a beautiful waterfall, where odds are we only see it through the lens of our phone, right? I'm always struck by when I have seen some beautiful experience, and I was really focused on capturing the video or getting the best picture. And then I go away from it afterward, I'm like, I don't remember what I saw. Again, it becomes a self-fulfilling thing, right? You need the phone as a reminder of what you saw because you weren't actually paying attention to it because you were trying to capture on your phone. Whereas if you hadn't taken your phone out of your pocket, you would have a mental image still imprinted. Or maybe you wouldn't because you've lost the capacity to do that, but if you practice for a while, you will actually, again, regain that human capacity to remember vividly things that you saw, which I think we're really losing. So I guess one discipline that I do think I'm pretty good at, and that I would highly recommend, is to really resist, or at least to think very intentionally about when you're trying to when you're on an outing that you're planning to take pictures, and then when you're not, and to really, when you say I'm not here to take a picture, refuse to take your phone out of your pocket and just take in whatever beautiful thing you're experiencing, because I think many people are sort of experiencing their own lives vicariously. That they're experiencing their own lives through their Instagram feed of the things that they post that they didn't actually do because they were trying to capture the perfect photo. So that's one piece of advice I would definitely give. I think there's other habits where you could just as a family could have try to have Sundays as a device-free day. If you're in college, you and your roommates could say there's this one day of the week that we're all going to have our devices put away, or 1 hour, or we all have at least 1 hour in the evening together. We have a meal, and we're all going to make sure our phones are not within buzzing distance or something. Because just one thing I'll add to that is, I think we so often deceive ourselves into, we have this idea of multitasking, right? We think, oh, I'm here, I'm present in this conversation, but I'm also present in this conversation down here, right? And again, the reality is, you don't remember, you think you are multitasking because you heard the person speaking, but you don't remember what they just said because your attention wasn't actually on them, right? So to be really honest with ourselves about that we really only can attend to one thing at once. And so we need to decide what that one thing is going to be.
Yeah, with the onset of remote work and a lot of Zoom, everything's kind of gone online. And I've found that people tend to not want to get out and meet people face to face. How do you confront that when you are trying to find community, maybe even outside of the church? What do you do?
Yeah, I quit my job and moved hundreds of miles away to one where I could be nearer colleagues. But that's not always a viable solution. And there were a lot of factors in that. But it was the case that I was doing a job that, like most of my colleagues, were remote, and I had to interact with them on a phone or through a screen, and I found it very, very, very frustrating. I do think I think we have to take that very seriously as at least one criterion in what job you're doing, right? In thinking about a job, we always think, how much does it pay? What are the benefits? What is, and we think, what's the location like, et cetera, et cetera. But to really throw into the balance, does it give me the benefit of interacting face to face with other human beings? And if it doesn't, that's maybe I should take a $15,000 a year pay cut or whatever just for that. Just like to think that is actually a really big. It's not that you can't do remote work, but at least to again recognize the job better be good in a lot of other ways to justify that loss that you're kind of inflicting on yourself. But I think part of what you're also getting at is, within, it's not just within an organization or a workplace, but as people are working more from home, this could cut both ways. I don't know. Like possible benefit that could come from more people working remotely and working from home is they actually get to know their neighbors more. Because if you're working a job where you get up at 6:30 a.m. to commute and get back at 7:30 p.m. and eat dinner and go to bed, you never see anybody who actually lives around you. And one of the things that was interesting during COVID was our DC commuter neighborhood suddenly kind of came to life with people, actually being around and walking their dogs and so on. But there's also people who it means that there's a certain type of person who it means they just never leave their house at all now. They don't even need to leave it for work. So I think we've just moved into this new neighborhood, and there are a couple people. There's one person we've never ever seen that person leave their house. So we're gonna try to be very, almost kind of obnoxiously outgoing neighbors, in terms of if anybody is walking their dog, hi, waving very vigorously to them, and doing a cookout in our driveway and trying to invite all the neighbors. I think we need to really kind of be very aggressive and intentional about creating the opportunities for in-person communication that would have once just happened really normally.
So, you talked about how some technology has been used to make things that just should not have been made, or do things that should not have been done. But there's also a level of, especially with the last question, technology that has been made to make things more practical and more easy, even if you are giving away some things to get it. It's for example, the automatic checkout in grocery stores. If you go to the same hardware store over and over again, you're gonna know the people who work there, whereas you go to the Kroger near your house for 2 years and never really know who works there, who doesn't recognize anyone.
Yep.
So how do you go about setting a line for where these practicality things, these time savers or helpful things, become too much? And is it just a personal thing, as in each person gets their own choice of how far it's supposed to be, or should it be more of an ultimate standard?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things we have to be mindful of in those situations is be mindful not just of the harms to yourself, but to others. That is to say, as a consumer, I can think to myself, well, all right, let's weigh the pros and cons here. The pros are I get to check out faster. The cons are, sometimes the machine is stupid and I have to stand there and wait for the sales associate to come over, and it actually takes longer. And the cons are that I don't have the benefit of human interaction while I'm shopping, and that can feel like I can feel like a benefit. Right? Often I'm sort of I'm grumpy. At the end of the day, I don't want to talk to anybody good. Just got a machine here, right? But if I'm honest with myself, all right, that's not good for me, right? But I also need to throw into the balance not just my own pros and cons, but thinking of the people who work there, right? What are these technologies doing to the nature of work? And I think that's something we have such a consumer mindset that we rarely think about the importance of meaningful, fulfilling work. And sometimes there are labor-saving devices that they make the consumer's experience easier, and they make the worker's job easier in the one sense, but also much less meaningful, right? So if you are working at one of these, at most supermarkets or whatever now, your job doesn't really involve hardly interacting with any human beings the rest of the day, right? You've got your app on, you've got your electronic device that tells you where, how to stock the shelves, and then if God forbid a customer actually comes over and asks you how to find something, You don't have to go and show them where it is in the store or whatever. You just look it up on your app and say, oh, it's an aisle, A15 or whatever. Right? So you don't even have to know your own way around the store. And then you don't have to check them out because they're just being checked out by the automatic checkout, right? So many people working in retail now, like retail's never been exactly the most amazing, fulfilling occupation for most people. Some people really love it, right? But it's becoming much, much less so now because we are kind of dehumanizing and depersonalizing retail workers. We basically are saying, we don't want to interact with you, therefore we're going to try to automate this whole experience. So I think, again, I'm giving really long-winded answers here. That's a long-winded way of saying, when you're weighing those pros and cons, be mindful not just of the cons to yourself, but the cons to the people on the other end of it, who you could be making their day more meaningful by saying, oh, I'm actually going to make a point of going through the in-person checkout and making conversation with the checkout person. As to, is that just an individual thing, or what do we do, this is kind of a collective action problem in many ways. How do we solve it at the level of collective action? I don't think that's the sort of thing that you could have I think there are some ways in which we can help around the edges with public policy, right? So you can't, I don't think, like you could have a public policy that says, we are banning automatic checkouts. We believe a society of people who actually talk to the checkout lady is a good thing, right? So therefore, but I think that's pretty totalitarian. So what you can have at the very least is, this is something I was just talking to, I think, Brandon about at dinner, and I've written on, is right now we're basically getting to the point where you have to have, you have to have a smartphone in order to carry out normal transaction in all kinds of places of business, right? So we could have public policy that says we are actually going to make sure that's not the case. We're going to at least make sure that a customer who wants to do this the old-fashioned way can do it the old-fashioned way. And if we at least create that option again, I think we'd be surprised how many people opt back into that option.
We can do one more. It has to be an easy question.
Are you familiar with Cal Newport and digital minimalism?
I know the name. I know that I've been recommended, but I have not read it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I would recommend Cal Newport and digital minimalism to everybody here. But so he's in DC. He's a computer scientist, and he's a secular humanist. But one of his main theses is the name of his most popular best-selling book, Digital Minimalism, meaning that if you're on Facebook and all the social media things, go off of it for 6 months or whatever, fast on it, and see if you actually miss it. Was it actually fulfilling any real value proposition in your life? And the answer is mostly no, because how Facebook started and how it is now, it's all radically different with the like feature and all that kind of stuff. So, but he's very much a secularist, and so you haven't read the book, so maybe this question isn't as helpful.
It might be a short answer, at least.
Yeah. But he's wildly popular, and simplifying your digital life so that you can another book he has is called Slow Productivity. So all this frenetic emailing, and everyone think they have to respond to every text message and every tweet and everything, and all this nonsense that everybody thinks you have to have all these plugs into your head and responding to everything. He totally rejects that. He doesn't say it's not human, but he rejects it because it makes you less productive and you can't focus all your brain power on the one thing you're called to do. For him, like coding all day, because he's a computer programmer. So what I was going to ask you, and this may not be a great question now, was you really situate sort of this digital minimalist approach in the context of virtue and humanity. So someone like him who's just looking at it from a I just know our brains are not wired this way. We are not, as my kids always know, I always say, I am not a robot. You may write that down and put it on my desk. I am not going to receive every question that you have because I just can't take all this input all the time. Yep. And it's like that exponentially when it's digital because you have all these other people trying to have access to you all the time. So I guess I was just, my question is, short question, how helpful is it if it's just a practical hack that is not situated within the context of virtue and humanity?
Yeah. I can't answer that because, although I haven't read him, I have read Jonathan Haidt, who's also coming from a secular humanist standpoint. And what's interesting is, so Haidt approaches all these things from a standpoint of evolutionary biology, and he basically says, look, it took us millions of years to become the kind of creature that we currently are, and this technology has radically changed in the last 30 years. From a standpoint of evolutionary biology, there's no moral reason in principle why it would be bad for us to be, like, if we could become a very different kind of being that is capable of thriving in this new technological ecosystem, well, that'd be fine, because, like, there's nothing morally normative about humanity as it currently is. That's just how it's evolved. But it's nonetheless the case, from that standpoint, it takes a very, very long time to evolve that way. And so Haidt's going to say, okay, maybe, 3 million years from now, we could become the kind of creature that thrives in social media. But we can't do it in 30 years, right? And so in the meantime, this is how human nature works because of the constraints of how it has in fact evolved. And because this is how it works, this is also how it doesn't work, and therefore we should beware of using technologies in ways that are sort of at odds with how we have evolved, right? And I think a Christian can basically take a lot of that and just substitute in the word how we were designed instead of how we have evolved. And the argument still works. In fact, it just works even more strongly, right? We would say, not only have we evolved this way, and it would take a very, very long time for us to evolve anything else, but in fact, we were designed this way, and God knew what he was doing, and if we're trying to live in a way that's at odds with that fundamental design, there's just no way it's going to work, right? So I think that's the nice thing about a virtue ethics approach is it is pragmatic. It's saying, look, this is the kind of creature humans are. These kinds of things, these kinds of behaviors and habits work and help us become better. These kinds of behaviors don't work and make us become worse. And you can have, Aristotle has a very, very good virtue ethic without anything approaching a Christian doctrine of God. So Christianity strengthens the argument, but I think we can find a lot of common ground here with unbelievers who just perceive certain facts about human nature.
Dr. Littlejohn, it's been wonderful to have you back at New College Franklin. Please join me in giving thanks to